Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for the July CCA Accelerator webinar. I am Jamia Stokes and I serve as the Alliance Engagement Director for the Southeast region. I've been on the CCA team since January of 2025 and I'm so excited to be in this role. Today, we're going to be spending some time learning about emergency aid and how to better support campuses who are thinking about ways to create more streamlined emergency aid programs. I am joined today by two guests from the Hope Center. Mark Huelsman, the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Hope Center, where he leads the federal policy efforts to modernize higher education and safety net policies to support student basic needs. And also joining me is Bryce McKibben, who is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Hope Center for Student Basic Needs at Temple University. I am going to turn it over to them this afternoon to present to us on the work that they've been doing most recently on this topic, and they're going to spend 25 to 30 minutes talking to us about some best practices and general trends in emergency aid. And then our hope is that this will be an interactive conversation. And so once they're done presenting, I'm going to encourage you to turn your cameras on, raise your hand, participate in conversation. So that's how we'll get started. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Jamia. I'll vamp a little bit as I find in my many tabs, my screen that I actually want to share with you. Okay, I think I found it. There we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Now I can just do slideshow. So as Jamie mentioned, I'm Mark Huelsman. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Hope Center for Student Basic Needs. For many folks hopefully are aware of the work we do at the Hope Center, but for those who aren't, we're a national organization housed at Temple University in DC, although neither Bryce nor I are in Philadelphia, where Temple is housed. So I feel a little bit sheepish, but we're kind of all over the country. We do several things related to research, investigating sort of the scale and scope of student basic needs and security on campus, whether that's food, housing and homelessness, and the ability to afford essential needs like childcare, transportation, technology, and all of the sort of must-haves that anyone needs to thrive, but also students certainly need to get across the finish line. So we're probably best known for our national survey that comes out every couple of years that sort of gives a national perspective on the scale of the problem of student basic needs and security. But we also do a lot of work one-on-one and in cohorts with institutions to try to build ecosystems of support on campus. And then Bryce and I, who you're stuck with today, primarily focus on policy reforms and sort of systemic changes that we'd like to see, primarily at the federal, but certainly at the state and institutional level as well, to implement evidence-based reforms to help students meet their needs, to unlock some of the resources and benefits that many people outside of college campuses can potentially take advantage of, and to really eliminate red tape and administrative burdens that students face in accessing support. So I say that to say that a lot of what we talk about today is going to touch on, kind of the federal and state policy lens of emergency aid. But we do want to open it up to discussion about what we and our colleagues and our partners in our conversations are unearthing about what matters in this particular topic on emergency aid. And the reason I like talking about emergency aid so much is the work we do at the Hope Center is sort of again, taking a comprehensive view of students' needs, and emergency aid sort of sits in the middle of so many different needs that students face, right? And so many intersecting needs, which we'll talk about a little bit. So it really serves as a really useful tool and holds a lot of promise, as one of the mechanisms that we can use to address the crisis we face on campus. So before I start going into it, I'm going to let Bryce introduce himself too and talk a little bit about his background.
Sure, I'll be brief. Hey, everybody, I'm Bryce McKibben. Before coming to the Hope Center, I spent about 8 years on Capitol Hill working for the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the HELP Committee. where I was the policy advisor for the ranking member, then chair of the committee, Patty Murray of Washington State. And I advised her and led the portfolio on higher education. We worked on a lot of bills there, including 3 different packages of pandemic relief that started with the CARES Act in 2020, that then set the stage for a massive expansion of emergency aid by providing the first national funding. Also worked on a bunch of other financial aid packages like FAFSA simplification, and expanded data sharing between Department of Ed and IRS. But we're definitely here to talk about the core affordability innovations that happened there. And now I'm very, very pleased to be on the Hope Center side, where we advocate for continuing what worked and expanding that, and trying to now, in a sort of a different political environment now, keep additional threats against student basic needs security from expanding into federal policy. So look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Bryce. So we're gonna again run through some stuff and try to make this as interactive as possible. But I think one area that I think we need to start, and we like to start in this conversation about emergency aid, is just an acknowledgement that student basic needs and security is widespread, and has been for as long as the Hope Center and others have been documenting the problem, for now a decade or more. So the fact that we see in our survey data, again, consistently year over year, that about 3 in 5 students experience some sort of basic needs and security related to food and or housing, whether that's just an ability to afford, consistent nutritious food or feed their family without worrying you're going to run out of money at the end of the month, or having a stable and affordable place to live, or experiencing things like homelessness. It is rampant. It is widespread. It affects every type of institution and every sector, right? So it's not something that's as concentrated in just one area or one type of institution. We see it all over. And these struggles with basic needs and security are things that obviously exist in their own way, right? Food insecurity is an intervention to solve on campus and through policy, but these do compound and intersect, right? Money is fungible, right? The inability to afford food is often a function of the fact that your rent is too high, or you may face an emergency financial expense because you haven't been able to build up savings because you're spending, you're forced to spend far too much of your funds on non-tuition costs. So these things are all very related, and we like to think of these things as important in their own way, and sort of they have their own programs and interventions to help solve, but they're obviously often very, very intersecting issues. The other thing that sort of leads us into this conversation about emergency aid is it's not just that students and families are struggling to meet their costs, but life happens, right? We know this, from talking with students. We know this from common sense. We know this from every angle, right? The non-tuition costs, the sort of non-fixed costs that students face, often fluctuate, right, from student to student, year to year, semester to semester, and unexpected expenses can arise, right? Whether that's medical, whether that's personal, whether that's transportation, something you didn't budget for, happens to all of us, right? And support is often sort of limited in those circumstances for students. The other thing to sort of keep in mind throughout this discussion is one of the reasons emergency aid is so important and holds such promise is frankly because so many of our other programs, whether they're financial aid or public benefits, do not do a good job of supporting students. Students face unique difficulty among almost any other population that we can think of in accessing some of the, frankly, very limited public benefits we provide as a country and sort of the safety net programs. So, we focus a lot on programs like SNAP, which are incredibly powerful tools in reducing hunger and reducing food insecurity and allowing people to be able to pay rent, because their food, they have extra dollars going towards food every month. We know that students, again, are uniquely unable to access SNAP, even among those likely eligible for the program, and those who do meet sort of what are onerous eligibility requirements, which we don't need to get into today because this isn't a SNAP webinar. Over 2/3, report not receiving benefits. So, and that's contrasting to most people across the population who are eligible for benefits, usually can access them at some point. So, students face unique hurdles in accessing public benefits, meaning there needs to be other resources that help them on campus and off. And so we know life happens, right? We know that students really don't often have the resources that they need to meet their needs, unexpected or expected. But we know that emergencies, can hinder student success. So something we found in our survey that I think is a really interesting data point. We survey students who are in school now but had previously stopped out, and ask them why they stopped out. And nearly a third of students cite an unexpected financial emergency for reasons they had previously stopped out of college. Another third of students cited, insufficient funds for living expenses, which, in my mind, you can, connect with emergency expenses. So it tends to be a very high reason or highly cited reason why students do not finish. Again, none of this is rocket science, but when you sort of see it crystallized in the data, that's a very high number of students who are stopping out. And these are sort of the best case scenarios. These are the ones that made it back. So we tend to think the number is even higher than this. So that's sort of setting the stage for what the problem is, right? I also just realized I put a slide in it. I'll come back to this slide because I put it in the wrong order. But I want to talk a little bit about, okay, well, we know this, and we've known this for some time about emergency aid at sort of a research perspective, from a practice perspective, and from a policy perspective. So Bryce mentioned sort of what we've kind of been able to do and see and promote, even if it's fleeting at the federal level over the past few years. So I'm going to have him talk a little bit about the federal experience with emergency aid, and then we'll draw into, okay, what does that mean for states and institutions in this current moment? So Bryce, take it away and just tell me next slide and poke me with a stick when you need me to.
Sure. So starting in early 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic was sort of breaking out across the nation, Congress was at the time trying to figure out how they could allocate enough funding to keep students enrolled during a time of just unprecedented transition. As Mark was saying, traditional financial aid tools like Pell Grants and disbursement of student loans and campus-based aid were well known to take quite a bit of time and have quite a bit of procedures for students and not potentially be responsive to something that came up pretty urgently, like a student suddenly needing to change where they live or travel back home to visit family or move to a fully remote environment in which they didn't have technology already at their disposal. So beginning with the CARES Act and then moving through two more pieces of legislation and ending with the American Rescue Plan in early 2021, Congress ultimately dedicated about $76 billion to total emergency relief, and this was split almost half and half between students and general support to institutions of higher education. All told, about $40 billion of that went to emergency financial aid. This was distributed on a formula to institutions directly that was heavily weighted based on the number of Pell Grant students they had and enrolled a number of enrolled students. The result was that for the first time, institutions of higher education were receiving an infusion of cash that allowed them, that they could disperse in a flexible way, in a manner in which they did not have to offset the existing financial aid, for example, that students might receive by saying, well, if we give you this new $1,000 emergency aid, we have to take back some other form of aid or reduce your student loan disbursement. The funds were given essentially to students with no strings attached, but in a way that we think is extremely positive, because institutions didn't have to go through the complicated disbursement procedures that they would with traditional Title IV aid. The other important part is that all students were eligible for the funds. Instead of having to verify all of the enrollment requirements, citizenship or visa requirements that you would for traditional financial aid, all students were eligible for the emergency aid provided by Congress under those three packages. And it could be used for not just their tuition and fees, but any of their emergency costs that they faced. So if any item fit within the traditional cost of attendance budget, food, housing, transportation, childcare, technology, those expenses were eligible for a student to be used. There was a little bit of a hiccup at the first beginning with student eligibility because then Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos claimed that Title IV requirements did apply to students, which meant that undocumented students, for example, and other non-citizen students might not be eligible for the aid. That was immediately taken to court and ultimately reversed, and all students were then again eligible for the second two tranches of the funds. There was also an effort to make sure that those funds did not count as income received for students. As you may know, a lot of grants and scholarships often are counted as income for students, which then, if they're filing taxes, makes things more complicated. So for the first time, we really had a truly flexible form of financial aid being directly funded by Congress, saying you don't have to do all of the, jump through all of the hoops, recognizing that it was a national emergency at the time and for, basically the 2 years after that, and allowing institutions the freedom to decide which students received that aid. You can go to the next slide, Mark. Ultimately, a large number of students, a vast majority of students in higher education received emergency aid grants. In total, about 20 million students were ultimately awarded aid. And we actually don't know if there might be more because there is a limitation in sort of the data that was collected. We're still sort of gathering some federal data in what was in who received the ultimate all of the grants during the period in which they provided over about 3 different award years. We do know, though, from some early research and data that the funds awarded had a very significant impact in students' ability to stay enrolled in higher education during a time, again, that was absolutely unprecedented, and a huge amount of disruption to students changing the modality in which they learned and having new expenses that they had never faced before, including their health expenses, but also just a fundamentally reshaped landscape of their higher education experience. The aid did go disproportionately to students with financial need, including Pell Grant recipients. There are other students who did receive aid because of the flexibility that was given to institutions who we don't necessarily think of as Pell Grant recipients or students who have a significant amount of financial need, but given that they had unexpected expenses, that may not have been fully representative of what their true experience was. So you could have a student who doesn't present on paper as having a very significant amount of unmet financial need at the beginning because of what their FAFSA says, but that data is outdated. It represents their income from 2 years ago. It represents the financial aid package that was given to them at the beginning of the year. A lot can happen in 2 years in terms of changes to your financial circumstances. And you may have changes to your family's financial circumstances that also indirectly then impact yours. Needing to fly home because of a sick relative, or your child has expenses and you don't have money to provide the adequate care. So emergency aid, not just for students who have, again, the traditionally calculated financial need, but may even not have apparent financial need, helps keep those students enrolled during a time of unprecedented disruption. Though there is sort of one other little auxiliary thing I'll mention here. In addition to the sort of direct cash for the federal emergency aid program, there was also the option to use SEOG, or the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, as emergency aid, which is a grant that typically institutions award in a financial aid package, and therefore, is dispersed at regular intervals along with other aid like Pell Grants and student loans. That was utilized by campuses to sort of supplement the direct dollars they were getting as emergency aid, but we're still lacking in a lot of the good data in sort of what actually institutions did. And it's that eligibility for that, that flexibility for that grant sunsetted in 2023. I think that's the end of the slide, Mark.
I think so too.
And the next one would be the state ones?
Yeah, the state ones. So I'm happy to kick
the
over.
The only transition point I'll just mention is, so federal aid, to sum this up, a massive infusion, $40 billion over about a 2-year period, really helped sort of expand emergency aid as a concept in so many ways, because although specific campuses and in some states had experimented with concept of emergency aid, it wasn't widely funded. And because the money was on the table for the first time, we really had essentially almost every institution in the country for the first time having emergency aid, as opposed to it just being a handful of colleges. And that really did set the stage here. And if you're wondering, where did this come from? Where did this concept come from? One was sort of individual experiments, and 2 was an infusion of cash that really made it possible for this to expand. And so now we see a bunch of states starting to try to fill the gap as federal funds have expired and the federal emergency aid program has ended, to try to replicate what was clearly a successful intervention in keeping students enrolled. And now that maybe they're not dealing with a pandemic, they certainly have plenty of other disruptions that could impact their basic needs security and their well-being as students, and therefore their decision-making around their ability to continue in college.
That is a perfect transition. So, I'm gonna go backwards to go forwards in my in our chat here. So as Bryce mentioned, there were, a number of institutions and sort of interventions and experiments that we'd seen with emergency aid, dating a couple decades, in the making. And so we sort of have seen these sort of piecemeal efforts as the federal government became sort of the primary funder or sort of instigator of aid, emergency aid. We were starting to see more and newer programs come online. There are a few states, though, that have been kind of leaders in this space, even predating the pandemic. So I have a few of them mentioned here. We are just sort of as an FYI, we're in the process of working on a report that sort of is a scan of state level emergency aid programs, what we know about them, the sort of distinctions between them, and some of the lessons we've learned, either through data or just talking through with the people who administer and receive some of these programs. So I'm sure there's some people on this call that overlap with some of these state programs, but I think there are a few worth highlighting and a few that are like coming online that we're very excited to see, their ability to meet the moment, particularly as federal emergency aid, and pandemic era relief has expired, even if that infrastructure still exists on most campuses. So there's a few states worth highlighting. Washington State has what's called their Student Emergency Assistance grant program, which was established actually in 2019 as the first tranche of funds. It's run through the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges. I'm a little sheepish in talking about this one because Bryce is literally in Washington State, so I'm always hesitant that I'm gonna mess up the program for his local program. But the Washington program is administered by the Board of Community and Technical Colleges. It receives about 4 million per year, 8 million on a biennial basis, and is sort of is probably the most established state program out there. It's used for a variety of reasons. Students can use it for, housing tends to be the most requested reason, but transportation, technology, food, health related concerns are sort of in the allowable usage. Washington is kind of a leader in thinking through this process from a student lens and trying to make it as low barrier to entry as possible. So, like eliminating requirements to submit too much additional documentation, right? Or eliminating red tape and trying to create, sort of a seamless way of, making sure that students are able to, one, apply for the funds and also receive them in a timely manner without too much bureaucracy. It is, by definition, it's a state program. And so these state programs tend to be very limited relative to, what we saw in the pandemic, right? Bryce mentioned, the ability of the vast majority of recipients and Pell Grant recipients in particular to receive emergency aid. Washington tends to be the most established program, but still can only fund about, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's somewhere between 35 and 45% of all requests. So most requests, sort of run into funding barriers, even in the most established program. Minnesota has a program called the Emergency Assistance for Post-Secondary Students Grant, which is also a really great one. It's been around since actually 2017. Receives about $7 million per year. Again, not on the level of tens of billions of dollars, but something that states are clearly prioritizing that is frankly durable in both of these states. North Carolina has a little bit of a different program called the Finish Line Grant Program, which it's often called a completion grant. It's not necessarily a traditional emergency grant in the same way. It's available to students who have amassed a certain number of credits and are sort of close to the finish line to make sure that they're not tripped up at the very end by an unexpected expense. We're happy to go into a little bit of these. We have sort of the eligibility criteria in a draft brief that we're going to be putting out. But there's also some newer programs we've seen come online. Michigan, in their sort of broader state college completion and college success strategy, their 60 by 30 strategy has a series of student success grants, one of which is sort of one of the 5 that institutions can leverage or apply for, is called a barrier removal direct to students grant. That is effectively an emergency grant. We don't have sort of data on its implementation or its implementation yet. And likewise, Virginia has a brand new one that came online starting in 2024, which also is a little bit different in that effectively what Virginia did was allow a certain percentage of state financial aid funds to be used as emergency expenses. So it's somewhat analogous to the federal SEOG perspective, where an existing stream of financial aid dollars for students is allowed to be held for emergency aid funding, and funds are basically distributed based on how much state need-based financial aid each institution gets. So there's some newer programs, as mentioned, that are just coming online. There's some data collection, there's sort of differences in the allowable uses, differences in application requirements, differences in eligibility for students. Some have kind of academic eligibility, some have other, criteria that they use. Some require the FAFSA to be filled out beforehand, some don't, right? So each of them have a little bit of a different flavor, but we're seeing more and more states sort of recognize that this is an intervention they can use and a tool in their toolbox. I'm gonna go forward for a second. We can talk a little bit about what we know from institutional, from some of these state perspectives, and from our conversations with folks at states and institutions about really what works. And I don't think any of this is super complicated, but it does really have implications for emergency aid program design and implementation at the institutional level. I think it goes without saying that students coming actively to an institution with a financial emergency probably require fewer barriers to entry than almost any other student that walks in the door, right? Often these expenses are very urgent, right? They need to make rent that month, or the need to get their car out of the shop, or they need to pay a medical bill, right? Or something, right? That's going to actually just lead them to stopping out. It's often a very acute circumstance. So low barriers to entry, including minimal eligibility requirements, not then cross-checking whether or not they have satisfactory academic progress, met, what their GPA is, what their, sort of academic, profile looks like, what their overall sort of financial picture is, right? You want to make sure you're targeting aid, but with as few, verification processes that are going to trip up the application for and delivery of that aid as much as possible. One thing that we're seeing also is clear application processes, being clear with students about what emergency aid can be applied and used for, right? Widespread outreach so students know that it exists. You'd be surprised at how many institutions have had these funds, and even with the HERF dollars, right? Knowing that these funds exist is only one half of the battle. So making sure there's widespread, multifaceted outreach for students and meeting them where they are, and really flexibility to meet students' needs, right? So we know that, again, broadly allowable uses, not being sort of prejudgy about what students are facing, right? Students come in with a need and not saying, hey, you should have spent your money differently. I think for some people that's very obvious, and for some it's not, right? And making sure that the broadly allowable uses are, again, as broad as possible, and then working from a broad frame into a narrow one, and being as flexible as possible for students, because every student's experience really is different. Timely distribution, making sure that the money can get out the door very quickly. And again, we've seen, I'll use the Washington example again from a state perspective, but also what we've seen in HERF, in the HERF experience, the value of understanding good data, what students are using emergency aid for, how much is being used at what point, is really, really, really important. I'll go into sort of lessons learned a little bit in this, but I think some of the things that I've learned in sort of researching these programs, you learn some very, very new and nuanced stuff based on the institutional circumstance, the student circumstance, and the state circumstance. And I have some funny nuggets that we'll get into in a little bit. We can talk a little bit about the road ahead on federal and state policy. I'll talk a little bit about, let's go into the sort of policy and program design considerations. Bryce, do you want to talk about this at all? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think you've thought a lot about sort of how we design sort of a federal policy, but I also think that trickles to institutions and how states set up their programs as well.
I'll talk a little bit about the sort of the allocation. First of all, when states are the ones who are leading the way on emergency aid, there often is not a ton of resources available because, as we know, state budgets are under extreme pressure. Most institutions are regularly having to sort of sing for their supper to be able to maintain their the level of funding for their operations, as well as for state-based financial aid programs. So oftentimes we're starting with small dollars. The federal infusion was a little bit different, and because there was a lot of cash to play with in a short amount of time, and that was intentional to be able to deal with a crisis. And the allocation was really broad. It was sort of based on the number of students, first on full-time equivalencies, but later moving toward balancing out with headcount. To be able to try to say, if you're a larger institution, you need more money. If you're a smaller institution, you may need a little bit less. There is an important consideration here, which, and sort of getting into the super weeds, is that generally speaking, it is better to use headcount for distribution whenever you can, because if you're at a state, for example, because full-time equivalency tends to disproportionately sort of count the sort of students who are enrolled full-time. Yes, we sum up those who have are enrolled more half-time or sort of less than full-time, but everyone has non-tuition costs. Every student, regardless of their enrollment status, has expenses related to food, housing, and transportation. We're all humans, and so if you recognize that there's sort of a baseline need, regardless of the student's enrollment status, it's generally better to use headcount to allocate the funds. The other thing is that emergency aid doesn't have to be sort of just the only intervention to support students in their success. One thing you can use is sort of as a sort of entry point, if you will, to connect students to other public benefits. So if they're getting emergency aid and you have a touch point with the student in any way, you might be able to say, do you need additional help related to food? And here's some information about the SNAP program. Are you a parenting student, which most institutions can identify using their existing data? If a student is independent with dependents, for example, do you have some information, or do you need some information about childcare resources that might be available in the community? Or if your campus receives a C campus grant, then maybe you have a childcare center on campus that you can connect students to. Those sorts of things that essentially create a little bit of a longer term level of support for the student, because they're not just getting sort of that initial emergency aid grant, but more ongoing support through a public benefit program operated by the state or the federal government. So SNAP, WIC, TANF, the community CCDF funds, all of the sort of alphabet soup of public benefits that we have across states and federal government. And then the other thing is to try to make sure that as far as what students can use the emergency aid for, that there is as minimal barriers as possible for the students needing to say, hey, I have an issue that I'm confronting, and it truly was something that was that was unavoidable, and I need those funds to be able to stay enrolled. Sometimes campuses, maybe they're well-meaning, they feel like they need to sort of be judicious in how they guard the funds, can create additional red tape inadvertently for students by having to sort of, extensively document whether or not they could have anticipated that the expense they were confronting was a valid one, and they need those, that they need the funds. And it's important that we not make students sort of have to go through a really arduous process to sort of validate that they had a need that was very clear for them. So it's important to sort of be light in how the institution requires students to document that an expense was unexpected or unanticipated. And I think that pretty much covers it as far as sort of institutional and sort of state and federal policy design considerations. But Mark, let me know if you want me to continue on.
No, perfect. I think that, we'll be quick, because I think we want to leave some space for discussions, but I think, a couple sort of takeaways. One is, again, this is sort of our policy hats, right? And making sure that we're, as much as possible in this current environment, trying to move emergency aid from, what was a sort of crisis intervention that was very promising and to what is a fundamental strategy, right, for addressing basic needs and student success at the end of the day. So, just things we're looking at and trying to sort of advocate for at the same time, and continuing to do work around is, I think that, we learned from the HERE perspective that having a permanent federal emergency aid fund, whether that's a specific fund that institutions sort of receive allocations through, or reviving the flexibilities through existing campus-based aid, we would love to see. And we think that, really provide, even a potentially bipartisan opportunity to really entrench emergency aid into the sort of day-to-day thinking about student aid. So that, that's something we'll continue to push on, and make sure that there's, that there's a general understanding among lawmakers, particularly at the federal level, that just because the pandemic's gone doesn't mean emergency expenses have gone. And in fact, given the increased cost of living expenses in an era of persistent and stubborn inflation, in an era when the cost of attendance for students continues to rise, this is the need is more dire, not less, right? In many places. So, I think that this is also just incredibly more important as we think about, not that we can anticipate the sort of like what it looks like, but knowing that, the sort of next national emergency period or downturn, that we have had success keeping students enrolled and meeting students' needs through this type of intervention, and not sort of memory holding or forgetting that, which can be definitely a problem at the federal level when you do federal advocacy. I think that, again, from a sort of storm clouds on the horizon, or not on the horizon, but actually here, perspective, I think something that Bryce alluded to is, we are deeply concerned and hoping to work with states and institutions, and certainly obviously federal policymakers, on the potential fallout from the most recent reconciliation bill that passed through Congress, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, on state funding for higher education. We won't go deeply into it, but we think that there's some impacts of that bill that are going to be very, very, very acutely felt by colleges and universities because of the now new obligations that states will have on funding public benefit programs. There's also just the general sort of broad pullback of federal funding and federal support for higher education, either directly or indirectly, through sort of pulling back of research dollars and other funding. But also other sort of pieces of the bill that we think are going to have pretty dire impacts on the ability of states to fund public higher education systems. So what that means is there's potentially going to be greater need among students as prices continue to rise, as life continues to happen, right? But also potentially fewer resources. So how can states fill the gap? How can institutions protect programs that exist? How can institutions tell the story of the need and the impact of many of the programs that we've seen that are wildly successful at keeping students enrolled, which obviously goes beyond emergency aid, but is inclusive of it. And then, sort of from a positive perspective, I think we're starting to see, again, on campuses, from a policy perspective, we have, a small federal amount of funding allocated to this, but the integration of emergency aid with other comprehensive approaches to addressing basic needs. We're seeing the concept of basic needs centers and hubs and navigators pop up at institutions across the country. There is some funding available to it at the federal level. Some states have started to inch in that direction. So how can emergency aid be one piece of that, right? As students, as Bryce mentioned, maybe are going in because they think they might be eligible for SNAP because that state or institution has done good outreach on that, making sure you're integrating, well, hey, what are your current needs? We might have the ability to meet a bill that you're experiencing that you simply can't pay, right? So integrating these strategies as much as possible and doing that from a policy perspective and making it so that emergency aid is one piece of the kind of comprehensive basic needs strategy. And last slide, I swear, before we get into talking about it, just ways that institutions can contribute. And I won't belabor this too much because we've talked a lot about it, but like, the more we learn about, many of these programs, the more that continuing to measure, quantify, be able to go back to and monitor the unique needs facing students, what I've started calling the when, the why, the how much, and the how long, is incredibly important. I'll just give a tiny example. We were talking to someone in Minnesota who was really great in talking about their program. And they talked about one of their lessons learned from administering a state emergency aid program was they kind of thought that the winter was going to be a time when they were going to get an influx of applications for student emergency aid, right? Winter heating bills go up and there tends to be more costs. Students have sort of run out of aid they were using in the fall. They just kind of had this anticipation that that was going to be a time of acute need. It was not. It was the spring. And part of that was a state law that it is a good state law, in my opinion, that prevents landlords from shutting off heating in the winter in Minnesota, because that's sort of an inhumane strategy. But then there would be all these back bills that students would face and families would face starting in the spring, in March or April. So that was a point at which students had emergency needs. That's such a small thing. We've heard from folks in Michigan that all of a sudden car insurance tended to be a reason that students, cited for either dropping or stopping out, or just needing an extra financial expense to face. So just these specific things, the more granular you can get, the more you can get ahead of it and anticipate it, and particularly with the timing of it. So just a reminder, like knowing your students really does matter in these cases, and the data you can bring to bear on that is super important. Getting ahead of federal and state appropriations and understanding where to fill the gaps, right? We're constantly monitoring the ability of lawmakers to come up with more or at least stable funding for campus childcare programs, comprehensive basic needs support, anything, right? Knowing ahead of time what funding is available and what funding may not be available will help you sort of push your emergency aid in a direction that you think it might need to be pushed. And then getting ahead of the great cost shift, as we've mentioned, the impacts that we are likely to see on state budgets with the current reconciliation bill, and just general sort of economic trends. And then again, we can't say it enough, like as you're doing emergency aid programs, connecting students with existing benefits. There have been a lot of things in flux in higher education and in public benefits. We know that by and large, student eligibility is very imperfect. As I mentioned, most students, even if they're eligible for things like SNAP, are not able to take advantage of it. But those eligibility rules have actually not changed, right? That existing guidance that what institutions can do in terms of using their own data to do outreach to students about public benefits. None of that has changed. All of that is still very much in place and live. And there are things that we think institutions can take advantage of to connect students with benefits. And using those coming in for emergency aid support as a touch point in doing that, we think holds a lot of promise. So with that, we went way over what we were supposed to do, but hopefully we did the right balance of inundating you, but also not leaving too little time for discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Jamia.
Yeah, no, you did a wonderful job of providing us with an overview of what we've learned from emergency aid and the influx of cash that we saw come in as a reaction to the pandemic, and how we got to this place of where we were managing crisis and how we need to think about moving forward with planning more strategically. Thank you for giving the specific state examples of institutions and states that are proactively working in this space. I hope that's helpful for our participants. I'd like to open the floor to our guest for any questions that may have arisen as you all were talking before I ask my questions. So if you have a question, please unmute yourself, come off camera, tell us who you are, and then you can ask your question. Hi, Michael, I see you. Go ahead.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you for a great presentation. So my name is Michael Gilmer, and I work at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. And we have found ourselves, at least within the Dean of Students Office, being the collector and distributor of emergency aid. And we have coupled that in with our student of concern process to really try to create that network of support for our students. And really exactly what you're showing here is that the needs are much more complicated. And a lot of it is just I guess a house of cards in some ways, where it's just one thing. Could have been the auto insurance that you brought up, but that's enough to tip over. What have you found as being the most effective and efficient way for institutions to monitor and distribute the funds in a way that I guess cuts down on administrative load and really expedites the process of trying to get the funds in the students' hands?
One very simple way I've seen that institutions were debuting at the beginning of the pandemic was, making the form literally a couple of boxes, name, identifier that you can link to the student email address, and like one box that says what the student's need is in terms of their unanticipated expense, and making sure that it is said that you keep it short, 500 character limit. And that goes directly to the financial aid office, that they can link that, they can see whether the student is requesting it for the first time or it's a second tranche, and that because the financial aid office had control over the disbursement of funds and didn't need to then clear that with the bursar and sort of the business office, but could quickly put that into distribution. That goes directly onto the student's account balance, or an institutional refund if if available. So I don't know if that answers your question, but sort of like, it's sort of like as seamless as a process as possible that had few sign-off layers inside of the institution that then pulled in, a sort of a process that would have to exist for every single recipient, because that just becomes administratively time-consuming.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was gonna say the only thing I would add to that is that there's a balance that we've seen in talking to folks about using the data and information you have with regard to like payments, right? Like if there's maybe an ability to sort of get payments out the door to students with existing, not asking them for additional sort of account number. If you have the infrastructure to get payments to students already, like leveraging that, but also not being over reliant on FAFSA or financial aid data, because we know, again, like there have been institutions that have or processes that have sort of required students to, have already filled out FAFSA to access emergency aid, which you can sort of understand the reasoning behind that. But also there's plenty of students for reasons that haven't been able to fill out FAFSA that are low income, right? So it's like there's a dance between overusing the data and the information and the financial aid processes and accounts that you already have, while just not overdoing it. So.
Thank you. Chelsea, I see your hand raised.
Yes, ma'am. I had a quick question about this type of aid. Is it going to reflect back on the student for future financial aid and if this was answered and I missed it, I do apologize. But will this be counted against them for other types of public assistance, if it's a significant dollar amount, or will it go against them for other financial aid down the road? And again, if I missed the answer to that, I apologize.
No, we covered just very briefly in a different context, and I didn't fully explain sort of what the sort of long-term or ongoing sort of policy change was. So it will not be counted against a student's financial aid package, or impact their eligibility for public benefits. In most cases, I say there is some limited impact when it comes to taxes in particular, but as a component of the FAFSA Simplification Act of 2020, a permanent policy change was made, sort of carrying over a pandemic era policy that says funds awarded as emergency aid or emergency financial assistance, anything that is essentially being given to the student for an unanticipated expense, is not counted as financial aid, or what is a specific term in World of Financial Aid called other financial assistance, or OFA. And when something is not counted, that means you don't have to then offset it by taking away something else in their financial aid package. It's not like, well, we have to reduce your Pell Grant, or we have to reduce your state grant, or reduce your student loan disbursement because you received this grant. It's not counted essentially in the rest of the financial aid package that would be awarded at the beginning of a student's of a traditional term of a beginning of an award year, and so it's not appearing as sort of that line item in the total financial aid package. That is a very positive policy change, and a really remarkable one that sort of, if we think about it, that sort of opened the door for this practice to grow significantly, because prior to that policy change, there was often a question of, well, do I need to sort of take this away somewhere else because it is financial aid, and that made it a difficult question for institutions to determine, is this really in the student's best interest? If I might have to take away something else, we don't have to worry about that now. Now, when the student does potentially file taxes, because there is a larger policy around the taxation of grant and scholarship aid for non-tuition expenses, which we would very much like to see Congress solve, and they really could have and should have solved in a very massive tax package that they just passed through Congress, and they did not solve, which is that if students are using a very significant amount of funds for their non-tuition costs, that is counted as income for tax receipt purposes, and so they can receive there is potentially a tax penalty. But by and large, the students who are receiving emergency financial aid are not already facing a very large tax bill. In fact, many of them may actually be eligible for significant refund or earned income tax credit or other things, but if they're not earning a ton, a full-time student who's not working is definitely not going to have a significant tax burden. So there's usually not a huge tax bill. And when you apply for a public benefit program and like SNAP, for example, and you're reporting your wage income, this is not going to show up as sort of wages earned. So it's not going to sort of kick you out of public benefit eligibility. The sort of asterisk I painted is that there are some programs who say, just show me whatever was on your taxes. And so if you're one of those students who, this showed up as sort of income earned and sort of your total net tax liability, it could be counted potentially years later for receipt. But we would say, and most students would say, the dollars received upfront for the emergency expense that they have that needs to keep them enrolled is going to be dramatically better for them than a potential small percentage reduction in their eligibility years down the line, right? The sort of urgency of that need. But I did want to be fair at sort of like saying that there is a potential very small impact on the sort of weight calculation of income earned for tax filing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from our guests? Well, I guess one of my questions will be, for institutions who are just now beginning to think about ways to create emergency aid processes that don't have state support, how have you seen institutions raise funds to help support these scholarship programs? Do you have any examples? Because I feel like those are some of the questions that I've been getting in the Southeast.
I can give one stab at this, and maybe Mark has an example too. But we see sort of institutional advancement pitches from institutions all the time in the course of our work. Including ones that come from Temple University, where colleges are trying to raise money for their students. And oftentimes the pitches, can seem distant. You're just generally supporting scholarships, right? What does that mean? Who are we serving? Most donors, though, can understand struggles with basic needs, and sometimes institutions can even say, we know we have, 1 in 4 students experiencing food insecurity, or half of our students experiencing housing insecurity. When the pitch, an institutional foundation pitch, or a pitch to potentially a local philanthropic organization, if you're asking for grant support or for another community foundation to provide funds to the institution, when it's for a purpose that is very clearly a social good that has significant benefits in student completion, that is a sort of like an ideal way of saying to the potential donor or philanthropic organization that the funds will be well spent. They are not just going into sort of a generic bucket that might be scholarships for students who don't need it, right? You can, if the funds are going to be spent specifically for emergency aid grants for students to keep them enrolled in school and deal with and listing out the kind of things that tends to be very compelling. So it isn't a solution to have this solely reliant on donors with cash to spare, so to speak. We need policy intervention, but definitely for institutions that are trying to raise those funds through their community foundations and through their foundation arm, that is a great use of that pitch.
I totally agree with that. I think the only thing I would add, and we've seen some examples of this in the past several years, is emergency aid, I think, is a really interesting and good example of when you're talking about fundraising. You can have a sort of like traditional institutional advancement, your foundation process, and make a really compelling pitch there. We've also seen in a couple different ways, like engaging faculty unions and student groups in the fundraising process, and that does a couple things, right? There's very good distribution lists in some of those cases, so you're reaching more people in terms of sort of trying to build a larger fund if it's privately funded, but also it helps with the design of the program, right? If you're getting, particularly student buy-in, I know that there was one example. I'm sure there's many examples of this, but UC Davis springs to mind, where there is a sort of a committee within the student board or the student foundation, I guess it is, that helps fundraise specifically for the student emergency aid relief fund there. And having students be able to both sort of tell the story, but also think about, okay, how should this be designed and it's kind of implemented? You're sort of baking that into the process a little bit. And same in some cases with faculty unions, right? Like these are people who are seeing students every day, who students often come to first when they are experiencing a need. So trying to think about how to be multifaceted in your fundraising and not just think about it like you would going after any other grant.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for those examples. And thank you for the links in the chat. I'll be sure to copy those and make sure that those are available following this webinar. Okay, with that, we are almost to time. I want to thank you, Bryce and Mark, for being with us today to talk about all things emergency aid. It's my hope that our institutions learned something today that can help them as they think through their own processes on how they advocate at the state level to get more support for emergency aid, and also advocate locally for how they can better support their students who are experiencing an emergency. Thank you for being with us today, and thanks to all of our guests, and we'll see you all next month. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.